34, and I'm just happy to know that if somehow I were to ever become an NFL head coach, at least I'd be high on Cowherd's coaching rankings. Like, that's real loyalty, and I respect that about you. It's one of the things I find admirable. I don't understand how far you have Kyle Shanahan down, because you and I agree on Brock Purdy. Like, if we know what Jimmy Garoppolo was, they were in a Super Bowl and another NFC Championship game. You and I think, know what Brock Purdy is. They were in an NFC Championship game and then a Super Bowl. So I would have Shanahan a touch higher. I have no issue with the Harbaugh or Tomlin placement, even though they don't have a bunch of recent playoff success. They're just always in the mix. Two guys who I think warrant you, and you said you had Dan Campbell right on the outside
Kevin
of the top
O'Connell,
10.
Dan Campbell, yeah.
Yes, so Kevin O'Connell was one of them. And Shane Steichen, I think, is interesting. It's very early, you know what I mean, just a year in, but it's just a year for D'Amico. He had a disaster at quarterback situation last year after Anthony Richardson got hurt. I liked what he did. And then one other thing I'm remiss to leave out. What you're saying about Kevin Stefanski is true, but it was also true for Baker Mayfield, who was the quarterback that took over that awful team, and then they made the playoffs. One of his 2 playoff appearances with Baker, his playoff win with Baker, all that. I'm just saying that's true, but I know you've come around on Baker. I like the list in general. Yeah. I think McDermott's a little high, Shanahan's a little low, and that's my biggest
Hey, let me throw this at you. Mike Garofalo, who does a terrific job, just reported this, that Brandon Aiyuk, the very talented receiver for the Niners, has requested a trade because they're not, that the Niners and him are far apart. Now, we have talked about this, is that Purdy's not a deep ball thrower. Aiyuk can be a really stretch the field player. That's not what, and again, if Josh Allen's the quarterback, I think you re-sign him. That's part of it. The other thing is, I think McCaffrey and Debo and the 2 receivers they drafted, Aiyuk's a weird fit for them. It's like we talked about Julius Randle earlier. Really good player, bad fit for the Knicks, don't re-sign him. I think Aiyuk's exceptional. I get this move by the Niners if they moved off him. What's your reaction on this?
My reaction is I think this will hurt Purdy a lot. I think that they've paid everyone. And they are planning, I think, at a year from now to have to pay Purdy. But C-Mac's the most expensive running back in the league. They paid Debo. Trent Williams, the most expensive left tackle in the league. They have Nicky Bosa's contract is unfathomable in the way it's going to kick in shortly. And so I understand you can't, and Kittle makes good money for his position. So you have to pick and choose your spots. But I think this will be very painful for them. Everyone obviously is immediately going to connect him to Washington because of Jaden Daniels. That makes sense. Yeah. And Pittsburgh, because he and Tomlin have kind of been openly flirting, it would seem, about a partnership at some point. So that makes sense. But there's a lot of teams that could use Brandon Aiyuk. I don't know that the Niners would trade with the team they're playing in the NFC Championship game in this clip right here. But the Lions, who still don't really have that wide receiver too and are clearly all in right now, that makes a lot of sense. You would have to think the Buffalo Bills, who right now have a pretty naked wide receiver room, but maybe their hesitancy would be, the Diggs thing didn't end great, and if there are concerns with Aiyuk and paying him. But he is an excellent player that it's going to be hard-pressed to find a team that couldn't use him. And I just don't know if the Niners are going to have a restricted pool of teams they're willing to trade with. But Brandon Aiyuk will get you a first-round pick.
Yes.
And probably a little bit more. He's that type of player, and I imagine he's going to get traded.
By the way, speaking of fits, I had said the Knicks, Isaiah Hartenstein only averages 8 points a game, but he was a great fit for that team because he was a real center who could defend fives. As the league is getting bigger, and the Knicks often play 4 guards, Julius Randle on a max contract feels like a bad fit. I think he's got value. I don't like this story today that James Dolan loves him. What say you?
Yeah. Well, listen, one of the best things that has happened to the Knicks over the last 5 years is that the Sphere in Vegas was being built and opening. And so James Dolan was focused on that and not the Knicks. He let the adults and professionals run the Knicks. And shockingly, all of a sudden, the Knicks have a real culture, a real roster, and they're real contenders. James Dolan now seems to be back in the mix. He's, releasing statements about saying how the NBA is going to become more like the NFL, as if that would be a thing people think is bad. And now he's seemingly meddling a bit in the front office stuff. One of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, to the contract Jalen Brunson just took is it allows the Knicks the flexibility to trade Julius Randle, not as like a salary dump or just pick up picks, but to get quality players in return. I think Julius Randle is a good NBA player. He has a brutal postseason resume, but it's a pretty small sample size, but it is really brutal from a field goal percentage standpoint.
Yeah.
But I don't know that he fits fully with this team the Knicks have built, and I think he's more useful probably as a trade chip if they are trying to acquire another center, so it's not just Mitchell Robinson as their only true five in the front court. I certainly don't think when you're going to have to pay Bridges, you already paid OG, you just paid Jalen, and even though it's not the 5 for 270, 4 for 160 is still significant. All those guys, I wouldn't give Julius Randle a max extension, that's for sure.
USA Basketball beat Australia. I think it's kind of ridiculous that Jaylen Brown's not on the team, but I do think after your top 6 players historically, Olympic teams get very political. I think Nike has injected itself here with Kyrie and Jalen. What do you make of the overall rotation of this team and what we should expect?
Well, I think, listen, right before we went on vacation on First Things First, I gave what my starting 5 would be: Steph, Ant, LeBron, Tatum, and Joel Embiid. And Steve Kerr, obvious longtime fan of First Things First, went with that exact starting 5. So I think they're off to a good start. So here is what's tricky. There is a strong argument to be made, Colin, that for the 12-man roster, have 8 stars and then 4 glue guys. Guys who won't care if they don't play, won't care if they don't get shots, are out there for one specific thing, whether it be their defense or their rebounding or their free throw shoot, whatever, guys like Derek White who are just happy to be there. There is an argument that makes sense, because why have Devin Booker and he's an excellent player, but as your 10th man when he might not be happy as the 10th man and he's kind of redundant. My biggest issue with Jaylen Brown being excluded is they clearly didn't go with that game plan. They went stars across the board, and I think they made a mistake initially in picking Kawhi over Jalen, because Jalen is better than Kawhi at this point. And then they doubled down on that mistake by not replacing Kawhi with Jalen. Jalen seems adamant that it's a Nike thing. At this point, he seems to have a strong case that Nike, had a real influence on it. Ultimately, it won't matter, because I know folks try to create a scenario where the U.S. is vulnerable. The United States is not vulnerable in this Olympics. Since they lost the one Olympics they've lost since the pros, they have lost 1 game total. It was in the qualifying round. It didn't even matter. They win by an average of 12-plus points, and there is not a single team in this tournament that has 2 players that would make our team. Listen, Shea on Canada, Jokic on Serbia, Giannis on Greece, we know. But the second best guy on all those teams would not make this roster. So I'm not worried about the U.S. at all, because they were up 24 in the second half against Australia, let their foot off the gas in a game that was a warm-up game.
Finally, I'm viewed as very overly critical on Aaron Rodgers, though I don't think I am. J-Mac is viewed as too pro-Jets. You land in the middle. Yeah. I have said that I think the Jets season will just come down to the offensive line. I think for old quarterbacks, Russell Wilson's an advantage of how he didn't have one and struggled. Brady and Stafford had one. Kirk Cousins, Atlanta, has one. I think all 3 will flourish. 2 already have. I don't think it's a great O-line. I think it's overvalued by the PFF and all those kind of sites. What do you expect this year? I think it's a very 9-8 team, and I think the O-line.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
That's correct. an 8 or 9 win team. And everyone's going to try to sell you this bill of goods of, oh my God,